straight guys who've been with transgender girls. What were your experiences like? This is a story I've never shared with anyone and probably never will again. I live in San Diego, and if you've spent any time here, you may have noticed the presence of some very attractive transgender women, particularly from Asian backgrounds. One night, my roommate and I went out, and I ended up getting heavily intoxicated. We somehow ended up at an after-hours hookah lounge, and this is where my memory starts to blur. I blacked out, and what I remember after that is just bits and pieces. The next morning, I woke up beside a tanned woman with back tattoos. She looked pretty attractive in my groggy state, and I felt proud of myself. Eventually, she woke up, and we talked for a bit. She started giving me a blowy, but when I tried to hold her, she playfully pushed my hand away. I didn't think anything of it at the time. She and her friend, who had come back with my roommate, eventually left, but we kept texting throughout the day. Later on, out of curiosity, I decided to Google her phone number to see if I could find any of her social media profiles. To my shock, one of the search results linked to an escort website, and I discovered that she was a transgender escort. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. I kept hoping I had made a mistake, but the evidence was there. She was definitely transgender, and I had missed all the signs. At first, I felt angry and hurt, but instead of confronting her, I decided to ignore her messages. Over the next couple of weeks, she continued texting me, inviting me to events and sending photos of herself. I didn't know what to do, so I just didn't respond. Eventually, I moved on from the situation. While it was definitely a surprising and unsettling experience, it didn't make me question my sexuality. Since then, I've been more cautious about drinking too much and try to pay closer attention when meeting new people. I still see her out occasionally, but I prefer to keep my distance and avoid any awkwardness. Oh, and her friend who came home with my roommate was also transgender, which I didn't realize until later when I looked more closely at some pictures from that night. I never told my roommate about what happened. I didn't think he would have taken it well. Story 2. When I was 23, I went to a nightclub with some friends to celebrate a birthday. We drank a lot, and eventually, the birthday friend and a few others decided to call it a night. My other friend and I stayed behind since it wasn't that late, and we were still up for more. Fast forward a few more drinks, and I was completely wasted. My friend was barely staying conscious at the bar. At some point, a really attractive girl started talking to me, and in my drunken state, I agreed to leave with her for a ride home. She managed to convince my friend, who was already struggling to stay awake, that it was fine for me to go with her. I barely remember what happened after that, but I do recall being blacked out in my apartment and realizing she was doing the deed with me. I was too drunk to stop her before passing out again. When I woke up, I had a brutal hangover, and my wallet was missing cash. My smoke was gone too. My friend was supposed to crash at my place that night, but because I left, he got kicked out and ended up passing out outside. I had to lie about what had happened. Story 3. I was in a relationship with a trans woman for about a year. We met at a club, and she kept glancing at me from across the room. I thought she was cute, so I smiled at her, and she smiled back. I walked over to introduce myself, and we hit it off right away. After chatting for a bit, she casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, I was born a man." It took a second to process, but I just said, "All right." She told me that most guys either freak out or disappear after hearing that. We danced, hung out some more, and exchanged numbers. Our relationship grew from there. Honestly, no one could tell. People assumed she was an exotic dancer because her implants were a bit too large for her body, but I liked them. Everything was great for a while, but eventually, she felt like she was holding me back from having a family and biological kids. I tried to reassure her that it wasn't true, but she became more distant, and eventually, we ended things. We still talk sometimes, and we're friends on Facebook. Story 4. I dated a post-op MTF girl for a couple of months. It was mainly based on physical attraction from both sides, and we never really discussed her transition or original gender. I didn't realize she was trans until we were in bed together for the first time. I was still pretty young and inexperienced at the time, and honestly, she was so attractive that I didn't care. She was more feminine and better looking than most of the born female girls I'd been around. Looking back, I think she liked me because I was a bit more straight-laced and didn't treat her any differently for being transgender. She wasn't looking for anything serious, and I think we both got something positive out of the experience, even though we were bringing different expectations to the table. Story 5. I dated a guy in college for 2 to 3 years, and for the most part, it went really well. We met at a Subway through a mutual friend who, with my permission, informed him beforehand that I was trans. I know, not the most romantic way to meet someone you end up loving. I've always been independent and wasn't really looking to date anyone, but I thought it was worth giving it a try. Things went well, but we took it slow physically, mainly because I'd never slept with anyone before and felt uncomfortable with him touching me. Another part of taking it slow was him figuring out his own comfort level with touching a dong in an intimate way. It took some time, but after about 6 months, we were having some truly amazing times in the bedroom. As I mentioned, we dated for a couple of years, and we moved in together for about half of that time. We got along well overall, though there was one quirky thing. He would never let me have a bite of whatever he ordered at a restaurant, even if I paid. But eventually, living together all the time kind of drained the energy out of the relationship. He struggled with depression, something he'd always dealt with, and spent most of his days playing League of Legends. This killed my drive toward him, which led to other issues, and the relationship ended on a sour note. Since then, we've reconnected, and he's one of my closest friends, if not the closest. Story 6. I dated a pre-op trans girl for about 3 years. We met online while at university, and things clicked quickly. Before our first date, she told me she was a transgender woman and had only recently started her transition. I was upfront with her about being unsure how I felt, but after we talked things through, I realized that the connection I felt with her and how attracted I was to her mattered way more than her gender. At first, I was a bit clueless, still thinking of her as my trans girlfriend or treating our relationship as somehow different from the others I had. But that was just based on my own preconceived notions, which got cleared up pretty fast. Thankfully, she was patient with me. Our relationship was great, her family was supportive, and my friends and family mostly didn't know she was trans. She passed and preferred not to be outed when it wasn't necessary. And yes, since someone's bound to ask, intimacy was great and a constant throughout the 3 years. In the end, things didn't work out, but it was mainly due to personal differences and diverging life plans. Overall, it was a wonderful relationship. I learned a lot about myself and the LGBT community, and I've found that I might lean more into bi-curiosity these days. Story 7. Weirdly, we met at a pet store while I was picking up supplies for my chinchillas. She was buying things for her ferret, and we started chatting about small animals. She was really smart and super cute. It came up that we lived pretty close to each other, so we made plans to grab drinks at a bar nearby. She gave me her number, and we went our separate ways. When I got back to my apartment, I had a text from her saying, "By the way, I'm trans MTF." I spent a good 10 minutes trying to figure out if it was a joke, but eventually, I just shrugged it off and asked when she wanted to grab those drinks. I met up with her at her place, and we walked to the bar. It was January in Minneapolis, so it was freezing cold. We had a few hot toddies and had a great conversation about family and growing up. Then she asked if I'd like to see some of her paintings, so I agreed. We walked back to her place, talked about her art, and I met her ferret. Being winter in Minneapolis, we ended up cuddling to stay warm, and it wasn't nearly as awkward as I'd imagined. Eventually, we ended up sleeping together. We went out a few more times that winter, but things ended because our aspirations didn't align. She mentioned that a common problem she faced when dating men as a trans woman was fetishization. Men rarely treated her as a person, let alone as a woman. I like to think I didn't do that. Either way, I hope she's doing well these days. Story 8. I'm trans, and I've been dating a straight guy for a little over a year now. It's kind of funny how we ended up together. He's been one of my closest friends for about half my life, and honestly, he's the only friend who's stuck with me that long. We always had that old couple vibe, even when we were just friends. In fact, one of his ex-girlfriends once complained that I seemed more like his girlfriend than she did, which, looking back, feels oddly prophetic. He's known for about 10 years that I was trans. I told him shortly after I figured it out myself, but I didn't commit to making any changes until about 2 years ago. There was a time when I went into full denial, trying to convince myself I could live as a guy. Spoiler, I couldn't. During that time, he joked, "If you were a chick, I'd date you." No, that wasn't the thing that convinced me, but it stuck with me because, truth be told, I had feelings for him for a long time. Once I finally got my head on straight enough to start transitioning, he saw me in a new light. One thing led to another, and bam, we were a couple. Being trans hasn't been as difficult as I thought it would be. There have been a couple of bumps along the way, especially in the bedroom, mostly my own issues, like a no-touching zone. But we've still found ways to be intimate, and that's felt really nice. Aside from that, well, what else is there to say? We're boyfriend and girlfriend, doing all the usual things couples do. Hand-holding, binge-watching Netflix, and even some more scandalous things in private. It just feels like a normal relationship, even though this is my first one to really compare it to. Story 9. I met a trans girl online, and when we first met, she hadn't come out as trans to anyone yet. We talked for a while, and eventually, she told me that she felt like a woman in a man's body. I supported her through her transition, and over time, She told me she had feelings for me. We became a couple, and we're still together to this day. She's not fully through with her transition yet, but she already looks like a cute woman. She's planning to start HRT soon. She makes me happy every day, and I hope I do the same for her. Story 10. We met several times at an adult-run happy hour and really hit it off. We had great conversations, plenty of laughter, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. At one event, we had the chance to play together, and it was an amazing experience. After another happy hour, we went back to my place and ended up hooking up. At the time, I wasn't very experienced with sexual encounters, so while I noticed something was different, I didn't initially realize she was a trans woman. It wasn't until our next time together that she opened up and shared her gender identity with me. By that point, I had already developed feelings for her, so it wasn't a big revelation. It just deepened my understanding of who she was. I felt honored that she trusted me with something so personal. She wasn't comfortable discussing details about her body before surgery, and it was clear she had been through a lot in her past. I never pushed for information, but over time, she shared bits and pieces of her experiences. I was aware that trans people often face discrimination and mistreatment, but hearing her personal stories really opened my eyes to the harsh realities many endure. It's hard to generalize about any group, especially from a small sample size, but from the few trans women I've known, I've found that we often shared a lot in common, perhaps because of the pressures of being raised male. She and I, in particular, had an almost uncanny number of similarities. We eventually broke up after a little over a year, but it had nothing to do with her being transgender. It was just the usual relationship challenges. Story 11. I first noticed him at a party, thought he was cute, and we ended up talking about Green Lantern comics. The night ended, and I didn't think much of it. Then, at another house party, we ran into each other again and started talking. He told me he thought I was cute. We kissed and ended up making out a bit. After that, we started casually dating. Nothing too serious, just hanging out, chatting, and kissing. Sometimes, he'd try to touch me in ways I wasn't comfortable with, but I'd gently redirect him to my chest instead. At the time, I was unemployed and looking for work, and since he had a few days off, he started coming over almost every day. The new relationship energy was intense. About 3 days in, right before dinner, I decided to tell him I was trans. He didn't know what that meant, so I had to explain that I wasn't born female. I did this over text, mostly to avoid any potential violence, which, unfortunately, can happen, or verbal abuse, which happens a lot. He was playing StarCraft 2 at the time, and I guess he was trying to process everything. After a while, he finally responded, "Well, I'm not comfortable doing anything intimate with you anymore." That really hurt. I cried a lot. It's hard not to take that kind of rejection personally, especially when things had been going so well, and there had been such obvious interest. He still took me to dinner later, which surprised me. We talked more, and I reassured him that just because I was trans didn't mean I expected anything from him physically. I told him he should only engage in what he was truly comfortable with, and he seemed to appreciate that. Over the next few weeks, we continued hanging out and enjoying each other's company. I stayed over at his place sometimes. Occasionally, I helped him with hand J, but it was always on his terms, and when I wanted the same, I had to do it myself afterward. There was one time he tried to return the favor, but it didn't feel enjoyable. I could tell he was uncomfortable and only doing it out of obligation. I gently asked him to stop. There was no point in continuing if it didn't feel right for both of us. Still, over time, it started to hurt that he wasn't willing to connect with me in more intimate ways. Toward the end of our time together, we did end up being physical. He mentioned he had never tried the back before, but he was open to it, with him giving. It was okay. He sprayed a couple of times, and I did once, though I had to take care of it myself. After a few more days, it became clear that his interest had shifted towards someone else we'd been hanging out with, a cis woman. Our time together just faded out naturally after that. We don't talk anymore, and we're not even connected on social media. Story 12. It might not be exactly what you were asking, but I'm a girl who dated and was engaged to an MTF transgender person. They were in the process of transitioning and, although they still had male anatomy, they were on estrogen and blockers, with plans for surgery in the future. For me, it wasn't much different from any other relationship. I treated them with the same respect as I would anyone else and saw them as a woman, just as they identified. More recently, they decided to identify as non-binary during their transition and prefer the pronouns they/them. I've always known they were trans, and while I didn't fully understand it at first, I accepted it and never thought of them as different. We met online through a mutual friend who thought we would get along because we're both shy. We started talking and eventually began dating, even though we lived about 2 hours apart. Because of limited funds, we couldn't visit often, but the first time we met in person was memorable. I had been in the hospital, and they came to visit me while I was still there. I'll always remember that day, the first time I saw them in person. It makes me sad that we broke off our engagement a little over 6 months ago. It was a mutual decision, and we're still friends. Both of us were struggling with depression, and it was really hard to support each other. It's hard to explain, but ultimately, though we loved each other, the relationship became too difficult for the time being. Honestly, it felt just like any other relationship. Their being trans never felt weird to me. The only time I felt upset was when others would stare at them in public, and I always stood up for them if needed. And, just to say it, even though we're not together anymore, I still love them. Story 13. I've dated a few trans women, if that counts. Each time, they were upfront about it. For those unfamiliar, bisexual and straight trans women usually don't have trouble finding partners. Personally, I've always seen it as having the best of both worlds. The first trans woman I dated had undergone gender-affirming surgery not long before we met, so she had to use dilators daily to maintain her V-depth. She had a set of glass dilators that I found beautiful. While her results looked realistic, there were subtle differences, like a round scar where her previous anatomy had been. One thing that surprised me was that her urethra was noticeably larger than expected. She was intelligent, had a great career, and was an amazing decorator. However, one challenge in our relationship was her need for external validation. She was determined to become a stripper at a local lesbian bar, even though she hadn't been on hormones long and had opted out of implants. Since she still had a more traditionally masculine build, the club was hesitant about letting her perform. She was very focused on being seen as attractive, sometimes to an extreme. Once, she even jumped on a pole at a club and started dancing spontaneously. Later, she had extensive facial surgery and ended up looking cute, though not conventionally gorgeous. She was tall and broad-shouldered, so passing as a cis woman was always going to be a challenge. At one point, I saw an old picture of her before her transition and was surprised. She had been strikingly handsome. I think losing that appearance contributed to her struggle with self-image and her need for attention. Ultimately, we weren't a great match, and we lost touch eventually. Story 14. I'm an MTF trans woman who has been dating a straight guy for over 3 years now, so I'll chime in. My experience has been pretty positive. We first met online about 15 years ago when I was presenting as female, though at the time, I hadn't started transitioning and hadn't told anyone in real life. He was part of an online community I was active in for about 3 years, along with several other friends. At one point, someone did some digging and discovered that I wasn't assigned female at birth, and that none of my real-life friends knew. It was a tough moment. I felt embarrassed and left the community for a while. Eventually, I came out to my friends and family, and when I rejoined the community under a new name, I reconnected with some of my old friends, including my now boyfriend. About a year later, he admitted that he was confused. He had been attracted to me as a person, and learning I was trans made him question his sexuality. I explained my situation, emphasizing that I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I genuinely identified as a woman. He took a few days to process everything and ultimately realized that nothing had changed for him. He had always seen me as a woman, and since he was straight, it made sense to him. That's when he brought up the idea of me visiting and seeing where things could go. At first, I was skeptical. A friend of mine had some bad experiences with online relationships, so I was cautious. But we kept playing games together, talking more frequently, and eventually started having phone conversations about building something real. During this time, I was actively transitioning and living full-time as a woman. Initially, we planned for me to visit for a week to test the waters, but life had other plans. After a lot of thought, I decided to take a leap. I packed up my car and moved 1,500 miles to be with him. It wasn't my first big move, though never for a relationship before, and I had a backup plan in case things didn't work out. The first in-person meeting was a little awkward, but I chalked that up to the long-distance move and the big step we were taking. Fortunately, we hit it off quickly, and now, here I am in my longest relationship to date. He's been incredibly supportive, even through the rough patches. I've met his family and friends, and as far as I know, no one has ever questioned my gender or our relationship. We have our occasional fights over silly things, just like any other couple, but this has been the closest thing to a normal relationship I've ever had. I'm grateful to be with someone who sees me for who I truly am. Story 15. I'm a transgender woman, and I'm in a relationship with a guy. Well, kind of. For some background, we're both part of the fantasy community, me more so than him, and we're both polyamorous. He's married, and his amazing wife is fully aware of and supportive of our relationship. I like to call us lovers. We've been together for nearly a year now. We go out, have fun, and when we get time alone, we sometimes act like a couple. And honestly, it's nice. He rarely brings up the fact that I'm trans, which I appreciate because I generally don't like talking about it. A few weeks ago, I realized that he doesn't even think about me being trans. He occasionally fools around with a friend of mine who's also trans, as well as a few cis women I know, and he treats everyone the same, regardless of their anatomy. To him, it's just a non-issue. He's a big doofus, and I love him for it. Story 16. Met a girl on POF, short hair, loved working out, that kind of thing. I love girls with short hair, pixie cuts, even bald looks, but more on that later. We meet up, let's call her Jane, not her real name. She's got this deeper, sexy, slightly gravelly voice, kind of like Emma Stone, but still undeniably feminine. She's cool, a little on the masculine side from lifting and having a low body fat percentage, with a muscular back and that nice V shape. Still, she's very androgynously female looking. I'm intrigued. We go back to her place, and when we started fooling around, I realized that she had no dong. She pulls my hand away, says not yet, and starts giving me a blowy. Eventually, I tell her I want to do it, and she says okay, disappears into the bathroom for a moment, then comes back, puts a rubber on me, and starts. Suddenly, she's super into it. I could smell the lube. At that moment, I put 2 and 2 together, but honestly, meh. I just go with it and enjoy myself. Afterward, we're lying there talking and I say, hey, I'm a pretty open-minded guy. Just so you know, if you ever want to tell me something, very little shocks me and I don't judge. She pauses, looks like she's considering it, then just says thanks, kisses my chest, and we go for round 2. Later, I text her, no response. I try again a day or 2 later, still nothing. Finally, I message her, hey, what gives? Was I that bad? She finally replies, apologizing for deceiving me. She says she really likes me but feels awful because she's post-op and hadn't told me. She admits she has slept with guys before without disclosing it. Personally, I don't think she had to tell me. So I just say, no worries, I kind of figured. Then I ask when we can hang out again. We hooked up a few more times, but ultimately, our political differences, she turned out to be a hardcore Republican, which threw me off, got in the way. 10 out of 10, would do again. Story 17. I've been in a relationship with my girlfriend for almost a year now, but we actually met on Omegle nearly 2 years ago. At the time, we were both just looking for a quick thrill. I'm not sure if she was fully out as trans back then or still keeping it private, but either way, I met her very early in her transition. The biggest challenge? She lives in Sweden, and I'm in Australia. After about 6 to 7 months of talking, I asked her out for the first time. A week later, she called it off, saying she didn't see it working. But over the next 4 to 5 months, we grew even closer. I'd even call her my best friend. One day, while we were playing Civ 5, she mentioned feeling calm, which was huge. Anyone who knows a transgender person understands how much dysphoria can affect them, so for her to feel at peace was a big deal. About a month later, I couldn't hold back anymore and asked her out again. This time, she either felt close enough to me or comfortable enough to give long distance a try. In mid-June, I flew to Sweden for 2 weeks, and hands down, those were the best 2 weeks of my life. We've even talked a bit about kids. We both know she can't have biological children, but I've told her that I want to be with her no matter what, and we can look into adoption or surrogacy. Interestingly, her mom is adopted, which I think would be great because if we did adopt, the child would have someone who truly understands their experience. As for the future, who knows? I'm struggling to find a job, she's a full-time student, and learning Swedish is proving to be harder than I expected. But one thing I do know, I'll do whatever it takes to move there to be with her. When it comes to telling people she's trans, my parents have no idea, and that's how it'll stay until they meet her. They wouldn't approve, and I don't want that negativity to affect our relationship. Some of my friends know, and my godmother is aware, too. On the bright side, her parents love me, which is always a good thing. Story 18. I dated a trans girl for a while, and I'm a straight guy. We were friends first, so I already knew she was trans before we got together. For me, the 2 biggest things that attract me to someone are their face and personality. I've never really cared about whether a girl fits conventional beauty standards. Her body was never a big deal to me. She had a naturally pretty face, even without makeup. She never had any facial surgery, but she didn't need it. She always looked fresh, effortless, and cute. And her personality? Absolutely killer. She was sharp, witty, and hilarious. The kind of person you just want to be around. It never mattered to me how she was born. I mean, I was born a ginger, and she never judged me for that. I don't care about someone's past. I care about who they are now. Our relationship was really healthy, but when I moved away, we decided to break up. We never did more than make out since she was asexual, which was a little disappointing at times, but I cared about her enough that it didn't matter. Just being with her was enough. Of course, I caught some shit from friends, people calling me gay or saying she was deceitful because she looked like any other pretty girl. But none of that mattered to me. What we had was real. It was innocent, youthful, and full of love. And honestly, I still miss her. Story 19. I'm currently dating a trans girl, and we've been together for about 2.5 years. She lives with me, and I'm incredibly protective of her. I'm fully aware of the challenges she faces daily, and I do my best to support her in every way I can. When I first met her, she was living as a guy who enjoyed cross-dressing a lot. We initially connected over our shared interest in anime crossplay, gender-bending cosplay. It was a unique bond, and it wasn't long before she came out as transgender. As for me, I'm straight, but I've always cross-dressed since I was a kid, not for excitement or anything, but because it just felt right. Am I trans myself? I'm not entirely sure. I feel comfortable in my own skin, but I do enjoy tapping into my more feminine side from time to time. Story 20. Over 10 years ago, shortly after I graduated from Marine Corps recruit training and was stationed at Camp Pendleton, I had my first experience with a transgender woman. While out in Oceanside, I noticed a beautiful woman who seemed to draw everyone's attention. She carried herself confidently and had a natural beauty that stood out to me. After spending a few hours exploring the area with some fellow Marines, we decided to catch a movie. My friend needed a bathroom break at a bar, so I wandered around the shopping center alone. As I was looking at sandals in a surf shop, I unexpectedly ran into that same woman again. Surprised by the coincidence, I gathered the courage to approach her. She was kind and engaging, and we hit it off immediately. After buying the sandals, we walked along the beach together, getting to know each other better. The connection was undeniable, and we spent hours talking, flirting, and enjoying each other's company. Later, she invited me to her place. The chemistry between us was palpable, and things escalated quickly. However, when I touched her, I realized she was transgender. I was initially taken aback, but soon understood the situation. We had an open and honest conversation, during which she shared her experiences and feelings with me. I felt a deep respect for her journey and for the woman she was. That night was a turning point for me. Over time, I've come to accept and embrace my feelings. I've learned that love transcends labels, and transgender women are just as capable of forming meaningful relationships as anyone else. My experience with her opened my eyes to the fact that transgender women can be incredible partners, offering love, understanding, and care. They deserve love and happiness just as much as anyone else. Story 21. My first girlfriend and current partner is transgender, and she's more of a cross-dresser. I've always been attracted to transgender women, and when I first visited Los Angeles in April 2013, I went to a gay bar in Long Beach for their weekly T-Girl night. It was my first time there, and I got up to sing karaoke, though I wasn't very good. While I was there, a guy struck up a conversation with me, and we became wingmen for the night. That's when I met her. She was also visiting the bar for the first time and caught my attention right away. She's from Latin America and had a beautiful, sexy appearance. We danced and chatted, and she shared that she wanted to transition someday. I mentioned that I enjoyed cross-dressing as well, and that led to us getting closer. We exchanged numbers but didn't see each other again before I flew back to Nebraska. We kept in touch through text, and I thought about her often. A few months later, in February 2014, I returned to Los Angeles, and we met up again at the same bar. We danced for a while before heading to a hotel in Santa Ana. That night, we shared an intimate experience. After that, we said our goodbyes since my trip was short, but we continued texting. I visited her again last month for her birthday. I stayed in a hotel near her in Orange County, so we could spend more time together. I gave her a gift, and she told me that I was her boyfriend, which made me really happy. We had another intimate night together, and I also brought along some lingerie to wear, which was a fun experience. It was still painful for me, but we enjoyed the time we spent together. Now, I'm saving up money to move to Southern California to be with her, and even though we're doing long distance right now, it's been going well. Story 22. As a transgender woman, I haven't had the same opportunities as some others to experience dating to the level where I would be considered someone's girlfriend. I've met men, had dates, and been intimate, but it seems I haven't had the chance to develop something deeper with anyone yet. When it comes to meeting men online, there's a clear difference compared to meeting them in person. Online, I'm upfront about being transgender, but often, I attract men who are mostly looking for something physical and don't want to engage in meaningful conversation. They often ask personal questions or only seem interested in physical aspects rather than getting to know me. Some even bail out once they realize I'm trans, having not read my profile properly. In person, I often feel nervous, and that can lead to situations where I feel unsure about my boundaries. I've always tried to be clear about being trans before getting intimate, especially before a kiss. But sometimes, I find myself caught in the moment and forget to set that boundary. It's not an excuse, and I understand that both parties should communicate openly about intimacy and personal identity. Over the last year, I've received a variety of responses. One man, who seemed sweet at first, turned me into an object after I shared that I'm trans. Another man I met while working at a gig seemed great at first, but after a kiss, he did some research and confronted me, horrified when he found out I was transgender. There was also a man I met on a train who treated me one way initially, but after the second date, he was cold and even tried to check for signs of my gender identity. Experiences like these leave me confused about dating and relationships. Being a Native American and Black woman who is mostly attracted to white men adds another layer of difficulty. Sadly, white men don't often date women with darker skin, and that's just the reality. I do find it encouraging to read about other women who found success in their relationships. I admire those stories, though I sometimes feel like I intimidate men. Additionally, it's important to recognize the differences in experiences between preoperative and postoperative transgender women. For me, I often find that men seeking someone like me are interested in specific physical features, which doesn't align with my own desires. I'm not interested in certain aspects of intimacy, and I've had unpleasant experiences in the past where men have tried to pressure me into things I'm not comfortable with. Ultimately, I'm just waiting for the right connection, someone who understands me for who I am. Story 23. I lived in Thailand for a year and a half and dated a trans woman during my time there. I've always considered myself straight, and before we got together, I already knew I was attracted to women, whether they were trans or cis. When we first met, I had a feeling she might be trans, but I wasn't sure. She told me on our third meeting, and my response was simple: I don't care. And that was that. Later, I wrote an article about my experience that was published on Salon. Through that relationship, I started noticing how much stigma surrounds men who date trans women, and more importantly, how deeply that stigma affects trans women themselves. Too many men treat their trans partners as something to be hidden, as if they're a source of shame. It's terrible. So, I decided to come out, if we want to call it that, and speak openly about my experience to combat that stigma. The response was overwhelmingly positive, except from some family members. I still identify as straight, but I also embrace the label queer. To me, both can be true. Calling myself queer isn't about misgendering trans women. It's about recognizing how society views these relationships. Many people refuse to see a man dating a trans woman as normal, and because of that, I find support in the queer community. Queer is an umbrella term that acknowledges identities outside of rigid heteronormativity, and personally, I prefer it over LGBT because it embraces fluidity and includes people who often get overlooked, like intersex and pansexual individuals. I'm so glad to see these conversations happening. We need more men to speak openly about loving trans women. We need to challenge the shame that's been placed on these relationships. If society recognized them as legitimate, we'd likely see less fetishization of trans women, something that remains a serious issue. We have a long road ahead before we achieve true trans liberation. Tolerance happens when society allows trans women to exist. Acceptance happens when society allows trans women to be loved. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.